So first of all, let me start by thanking the organizers of the conference for inviting me. I really appreciate that, and also thank all of you for being here this morning. One of the weird quirks I have is that whenever you put a microphone in front of me, for some reason I want to talk really loudly, which is completely opposite of what you're supposed to do. So please let me know if you have trouble hearing me, or if I'm yelling so loudly that it's very uncomfortable. What I'm going to talk about today is going to be what narcissists actually seek: pursuit of status, power, control, and respect. One of the things that I've sprinkled throughout the presentation are some artistic depictions of the myth of Narcissus. So when you get bored listening to me, not if, but when you get bored, at least I'll have a little art show for you to watch. I'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to start by telling you the take-home message, which is generally not a great way to structure a talk, but I thought since everyone here is familiar with narcissism, that I would just tell you the punchline. So if you are only going to remember one thing, this is probably the one thing to remember from the next hour or so as I ramble. My argument is that the desire to get ahead, now however we characterize getting ahead, whether we're thinking about it in terms of status, control, power, whatever it is, I think that is going to be the crucial element for understanding narcissism. One of the things that I think is very interesting about the field of narcissism research is that we are very interested in what narcissism is associated with. So there are plenty of correlations, there are wonderful lab manipulations looking at narcissism. And what I argue is that, and we've known for a long time, that status-related issues are things that narcissistic individuals are very concerned about. My argument is that status-related issues are not just yet another thing that narcissism is connected to. Rather, my argument is this is really the very motivational core of narcissism. It's about status-related sorts of issues. So that'll be the gist of my talk. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how I think about these sorts of issues and why I think status is really at the core of narcissism. So I'm going to take a couple of steps back just to help you understand my way of seeing the world. So when thinking about personality, I would argue that there are two broad approaches, certainly not a conceptualization that I developed by any stretch of the imagination, but you have a structural approach to personality, looking at the number of traits that exist, looking at the associations between traits, looking at the hierarchical organization of traits. A lot of the focus from the structural approach is based on cross-situational consistency. At the same time, there's another perspective on thinking about personality, which really is a process-oriented view. So you have issues, for example, looking at the associations between situational characteristics and behavior, social cognitive mechanisms that produce behavior, and really this perspective is looking primarily at variability in behavior across situations. What's interesting about these two approaches is that in the past, people have argued that not only are these different approaches to thinking about personality, but in some ways, unfortunately, they're viewed as being relatively incompatible, right? So people end up kind of talking past each other. You have the structural people that are very focused on structural issues. You have the process people that are very focused on process, and they aren't listening to each other very well at all. And I think that is a deep problem with the field because, in my opinion, both of these things are absolutely essential to really understanding personality. So that's going to take us to the realm of motivation. There are various definitions for motivation, but one of the common elements that tends to show up in definitions is that it's some form of wanting. Now, we can bicker over the nuances of that, but I think wanting is not a bad place to kind of start. Personality traits, we know, are often linked with differences in motivation. And so what some of my colleagues and I have argued is that, and we certainly are not the first people to argue this by any stretch of the imagination. Folks like Susan Fiske have been arguing this for a long, long time. But we believe that integrating motivational processes and motivation-related constructs into current conceptualizations of personality may really help to bridge the divisions between the structural and the process-oriented approaches to understanding personality. And so that's going to bring me to what I'm interested in, what I'm going to be talking about today, which is what is it that narcissistic individuals are really interested in? What is it that they want? Now, I'm interested in this more broadly. I focus on a number of different aversive personality traits. Narcissism is one thing I'm very deeply interested in. I'm also interested in things like psychopathy, borderline personality, and with all of those, what I'm interested in understanding is what's kind of that core motivational mechanism. What is the thing that's really underlying what these personality constellations are really interested in? And so today I'm going to tell you about my thoughts on narcissism. So I realized yesterday as I was watching presentation after presentation after presentation about narcissism that you probably don't need yet another definition of narcissism. So I'm going to skim over some of these things. I always wrestle with, should I just not talk about what narcissism is? So anyway, I'll very briefly mention what narcissism is. Tons of definitions. One of my favorites in recent years is entitled self-importance because it is very brief and I think also does a pretty good job of capturing the essence of the construct. Things like grandiosity, self-centeredness, feelings of superiority, willingness to exploit others, lack of empathy. We also, as we talked about yesterday, personality disorder versus personality traits. I'm not going to be addressing narcissism as personality disorder. I'll be talking about it as a trait. What I do want to spend just a moment talking about is the structure of narcissism, just so we're all comfortable and we're all speaking the same language. There's been a tremendous amount of work over the decades about the structure of narcissism, going back to the development, for example, of the MTI. Later on, if we have a chance, I'd love to chat about measurement-related issues, thoughts about how the measurement of narcissism over time has changed, some of the odd quirks in how measurement-related issues in narcissism have kind of manifested over the years. Aaron Pincus, I think, did some very, very interesting work in terms of helping us as a field start to understand more of the nuance in narcissism. I also want to give Mitya's group a shout out because I think they did a wonderful job in helping kind of I don't know if revolution is exactly the right word, but they helped kind of rejuvenate some of the interest in some of the conceptual issues underlying narcissism. I think Zlatan's work was very interesting. And I'm going to talk about the trifurcated model as being the foundation for the sort of way I think about narcissism. When I first read Josh's work and Don Lyman's work on the trifurcated model, it didn't resonate with me immediately. It was one of those things where I heard what they were saying. I had to go away and think about it for a little while. But over time, I decided that I think they are absolutely right about the core aspects of narcissism, and I'll tell you my thoughts about that as we go along. So just so we're all on the same page about this, so we've got narcissism as this overarching construct. We can divide it into grandiose and vulnerable, as everyone knows. And then the trifurcated model then begins to further distinguish extroverted narcissists. Again, the language starts to be a little bit fuzzy. One of the issues I'll mention a few times is the tendency for folks in social personality psychology to bicker over very similar constructs, but put slightly different labels on them. And sometimes I think we're really talking about the same thing. We just label it a bit differently. So I'll be talking about extroverted narcissism most of the time, but you could easily substitute in things like narcissistic admiration. I think we're really kind of quibbling over little differences in those respects. So extroverted narcissism, the idea of being characterized by a strong inclination towards self-promotion and a desire to be the center of attention. I view extrovert narcissism being kind of pure manifestation of grandiose narcissism, which is very consistent with the Miller perspective. Vulnerable narcissism, we have its kind of pure manifestation as neurotic narcissism. Emotional turmoil, intense craving for social validation, often accompanied by feelings of insecurity. With, I think, really the remarkable part about the trifurcated model that when I read their work, I was like, why hadn't we thought of this a long time ago? But separating out the antagonistic aspect of narcissism from the others, I think is very, very helpful in the way we conceptualize narcissism. So hostility, defensiveness, confrontational attitude toward others. As many of you will be aware, we'll talk about communal narcissism in just a moment. There is obviously no right or wrong level of specificity for thinking about narcissism. My own preferred level of specificity for the vast majority of research questions is to look at this kind of trifurcated perspective: extroverted, antagonistic, and neurotic. Can you make an argument for grandiose and vulnerable? Certainly. I do worry a little bit when people focus on that level about what happens with, I won't say contamination necessarily, but the fact that we have antagonistic elements both in grandiose and vulnerable. I do worry about the conceptual issues connected with that. I have deeper concerns. We move up even higher to looking at narcissism as a broad construct. I worry about what that means conceptually. I think there are some important distinctions when we get down to the extroverted, antagonistic, neurotic level. We also have communal narcissism, which we talked a great deal about yesterday. Obviously, communal narcissism isn't part of the trifurcated model, but I think it can be wedged in there, potentially. So as a manifestation of grandiose narcissism, again, characterized by the implication of pro-social characteristics to emphasize oneself and superiority over others through the communal domain. So as we talk about this, one of the things I'll be talking about is that I think with communal narcissism, it's still the same underlying goal. It's still about status, but I think it's a very different approach to how they gain status, and I'll talk about that as we go. So as far as what narcissistic individuals want, there have been a lot of different ideas over the years about what is really kind of the motivational core of narcissism. Things like self-esteem are frequently in the mix. I love self-esteem. I think it's a wonderful construct. I think it's very interesting. I do not think that this is really what drives narcissistic individuals. Clearly, it's connected with narcissism. Oftentimes, those connections aren't as strong and as robust as people often assume, but there is certainly a connection between narcissism and self-esteem. But I don't think it is because narcissistic individuals really want self-esteem per se. I think it is what self-esteem is tracking, is what narcissistic individuals are really interested in. We'll come back to that in a minute. Also, short-term mating opportunities is another thing that's often kind of touted as possibly kind of the motivational core of narcissism. There certainly is a great connection between narcissism and the desire to seek out short-term mating opportunities. I think you could make an argument that this is what the core is. People have certainly done that. Again, I don't think that is the motivational core of narcissism per se. I don't think this is terribly different from some other aversive personality traits. I think it's entwined with it, but I don't think it's the core issue. My argument is going to be that it's really about status-related sorts of issues. And as we go along, I'll try to explain how I think status fits into the connections that narcissism and self-esteem, as well as short-term mating opportunities. We talked a fair bit yesterday in different talks about agency and communion sorts of issues. So I just want to kind of share my thoughts about this sort of issue. For me, whenever I think about anything connecting to any aspect of social behavior, I love the agency communion model. It goes back, whether you're imposing a full circumplex structure on it from the Timothy Leary days with the interpersonal circle, which eventually became circumplex, or if you're just looking at these two orthogonal axes of social phenomena, I think they are absolutely vital and a wonderful starting place for any conversation about social behavior. Right? So these the big two dimensions of agency and communion. There have been a tremendous number of labels given to these dimensions over the years, going back to the idea of old wine in new bottles. People keep rediscovering in field after field and theory after theory, the same basic dimensions of social behavior, agency, and communion, whether we call it agency, whether we call it the vertical dimension, whether we call it getting ahead, whatever you want to call it, it seems to be a fundamental issue in terms of our social behavior. And so this agency dimension reflects our perceived ability to achieve goals, exert influence, possess resources, those sorts of things. Given the diversity of labels, I think getting ahead is not a bad way to kind of think about this. If you want to have a conversation with someone outside of psychology and you want them to grasp what you're talking about, I think talking about the desire for people to get ahead of others is a very crucial way to help people understand what it is that you're talking about with agency. The communion axis, also referred to as a horizontal axis, and in some recent work in the getting along dimension. This is going to reflect, of course, an individual's interest and ability to facilitate the formation and maintenance of social relationships. So my argument is going to be that narcissistic individuals are very, very concerned with the agency axis. Not to say that communion is irrelevant, I don't think that at all, but I think that at the end of the day, what narcissistic individuals typically will prioritize is agency over communion. When communion issues are related, I think it's often kind of in the subversion of the agency axis. They're using communion to try to get what they really want, which is status and agency-related issues. So this getting along. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what status is. Status is going to reflect one's position in the social hierarchy. There are two basic strategies for gaining status that comes from the anthropological literature. Evolutionary psychologists have talked a lot about this issue. You have dominance-based sorts of strategies that are really conflict-based. So the idea here is that I'm going to take status from other folks. I'm going to make them grant me status. The other approach is prestige-based, which is really competence-based. So here, the idea is I'm going to demonstrate my worth to the group and have individuals voluntarily confer status upon me. Within psychology, we frequently will get a little bit messy with the way we talk about status-related sorts of constructs. Sometimes we use status in a way to refer to this kind of broad dimension of kind of a person's position in the social hierarchy. Other times we'll use status to refer to just kind of the prestige-based dimension. And so I'll try to be clear about some of the where some of the work moves one way or the other. For me personally, I really like the broader perspective. I think there are different mechanisms, different strategies people can use, but ultimately I think they're the same goal. I'm going to try to ascend in the status hierarchy, whether it's through more of a dominance-based approach or a prestige-based approach. The need for status is a fundamental human motive. Status hierarchies are ubiquitous throughout various cultures, throughout every sort of social organization. There's almost always some element of status and hierarchy, even in peer networks of friends. Frequently there will be a friend who is kind of the organizing force, the person who's kind of sort of in charge. And these sorts of social group arrangements make a great deal of sense. They help things function efficiently and move in a way that is moving us toward the sorts of goals that we want. High status is beneficial in a tremendous array of areas of life: psychological functioning, physical health, mating, life satisfaction. Having high status typically has a number of benefits for individuals. Now, there are some downsides to high status that when we chat later, I'm happy to mention some of those. I won't talk much about the downsides of status, but there are some, and I don't want to ignore them. So I'd be happy for us to chat about those. It won't be a major part of what I talk about today, but we can certainly chat about that later. As far as narcissism and status, given the importance of status, I think it's plausible, and other folks have argued this long before me, that one or more psychological systems may have developed over the course of human evolution to help individuals navigate social hierarchies. Now, again, when we start talking about these sorts of ultimate explanations for things, it becomes very fuzzy in terms of, well, how do we know this is really why this trait developed? It's difficult to answer that. However, I think that narcissism may represent this sort of evolved psychological system for navigating social hierarchies. I would argue in most social interactions, we are very interested in getting either ahead of others or getting along with others or trying to do both things simultaneously. And I think one of the things that narcissism is doing is I think it's about the navigation of those status hierarchies. How do we get ahead of other individuals? And do we prioritize that over other issues like getting along with the people around us? So I'm going to tell you a little bit about one of the early models in this realm that my colleagues and I proposed, and it was taken almost verbatim from some of Mitya's work about the admiration and rivalry model, just tweaked a little bit to address status-related sorts of issues. And so here I'm going to ignore neurotic narcissism for the moment and communal narcissism, and I'll come back and chat more about those later. So as far as the underlying motivational dynamics for status pursuit, I would argue, in this first paper we were arguing about these two different kinds of strategies. One was an agentic sort of assertive strategy of self-enhancement, with the idea being this would give rise to the personality trait of extroverted narcissism, and then this would give rise to an agentic pursuit of status. When we talk about an agentic pursuit of status, what we were thinking here is that it would be a strong desire for status. So narcissistic individuals would want status. We thought that this agentic pathway would have a lot of flexibility in terms of the strategies that they use to gain status. We thought they would have positive perceptions of their own status. We thought that people with high levels of extroverted narcissism would believe that those around them believed that they were high status individuals, and that they would, at the same time, they would be heightened, they have a heightened reactivity to issues concerning their own status. Much like Mitya's original admiration and rivalry model, we thought there would be a nice feedback loop where if people were able to pursue status through this assertive self-enhancement kind of route, there would be an ego boost kind of feedback where individuals, if they were doing a good job in assertive self-promotion, this would kind of feed back into the loop and they would begin to do well because others would kind of buy into what they were kind of selling of themselves. The other approach was more of an antagonistic approach. This is more of a defensive sort of approach to pursuing status. This would give rise to antagonistic narcissism. In an antagonistic way of pursuing status, it's going to have some similarities as well as some differences from the more agentic approach. This antagonistic approach would also have a very strong desire for status. So my argument is that this is going to be something we're going to see in various types of narcissism. However, unlike the more agentic approach, there's going to be a very strong focus on dominance. Whereas agentic folks, I would argue, are happy to use, and I'll show some evidence of this later, they're happy to use either more of a dominance approach or a prestige-based approach. I can't speak exactly to this, but I believe what's going on is that for folks that are high in extroverted narcissism, they would prefer to rely on prestige, but they will use dominance if they need to do that or to get what they want. So they're flexible. I think, and again, not great evidence for this part, but I think they want prestige. I think that's what they really want, but they're willing to resort to dominance. Antagonistic folks, they are all about dominance. They focus on dominance. They don't want others to, they don't believe that others are going to grant them status. So they are going to take it. And so there's a difference in terms of the strategies that antagonistic folks use in their interactions with others in order to gain status. They have very negative perceptions of status. So even though they want it desperately, they don't think that they're getting it. They constantly see themselves as being not respected enough, not getting what they deserve, which sets up a very unpleasant cycle for them. Very heightened reactivity to status-related sorts of issues. And much like in Mitya's original model, it sets up this kind of ego threat sort of feedback, where they are approaching the world in a very antagonistic way, and not surprisingly, they end up with a lot of confrontational sorts of issues. So not terribly surprisingly, given the approach they have to interacting with others.
That describes Donald Trump.
Exactly. Well, you see, whenever I think about Trump, I think he is a perfect example of a number of these sorts of narcissistic traits. So yeah, I completely agree. So as far as this pursuit of status, I think external validation is going to allow narcissistic individuals to kind of elevate their positions within local social hierarchies. This desire for status, I would argue, is going to be so intense and so pervasive that it's going to shape much of the social lives of narcissistic individuals, and that these status-related motivations aren't held in check by the desire for affiliation, like they are for most of the rest of us who are not as narcissistic. For most of the rest of us who are not narcissists, I'm going to assume that none of us are narcissists. Of course we're not. Donald Trump might be, right? Not us. So for us, right, we both want to get ahead of others, but we also want to get along with others, right? So that we're kind of keeping our boasts and things a little bit in check by that desire for affiliation. Narcissistic individuals, again, when you put those two needs in conflict, oftentimes the need for getting ahead is going to easily outweigh the need for getting along. Okay, so let's turn to some data. So yesterday we saw a series of talks that were all very nice, and they were very focused, which is a wonderful way to give a talk. Mine is going to be very scattershot. I'm going to be all over the place talking about findings from this study for 2 seconds, findings from that study for 2 seconds. Very scattershot sort of approach. So I apologize in advance for that. So I'm going to tell you a little about, I'm going to start with some of the basic approaches to looking at the connection between narcissism and desire for different sorts of fulfillments of psychological issues. So the first study I was going to mention very quickly, we had 3 samples in this particular paper, range from US college students to Iranian community members. Across studies, we use different measures of narcissism. I'm a big fan of trying to understand where the similarities and differences are between different conceptualizations of narcissism. So we had different measures in different studies. But the basic idea, extroverted, antagonistic, neurotic, and communal. We use the same measures of psychological needs across each study, so a need for social status, so issues like I care about how positively others view me, need for power, I enjoy planning things and deciding what tasks each person should do, and the need to belong, I want other people to accept me. This is going to be a mini meta-analysis across those 3 studies, just to give you a sense of the patterns that we were seeing in these different types of narcissism and their psychological needs. So as far as the need for status goes, it's something that each type of narcissism was positively associated with the need for social status. Extroverted narcissism had the strongest association. Antagonistic was a little more conflicted. Neurotic, communal, social status was an issue that these folks felt was something important in their lives, and it was relatively uniform to some extent. We start looking at issues of power. Here we see, again, the extroverted folks, strong association, antagonistic and communal, hovering pretty close, and neurotic folks start to diverge here. So even though they want social status, again, social status in the way we're capturing it in this study is close to prestige. It's I want other people to respect me, I want those sorts of things, but it's not about taking status from others. It's I want people to respect me. Power is more, I want control over things. Need to belong, we see a very different pattern manifesting here. Extroverted and antagonistic and communal, all fairly low in the need to belong, but here we see a spike in neurotic narcissism. Neurotic narcissism has a very strong foundation. I'm very interested in the contingencies of self-worth of narcissistic individuals, and I've done a lot of work looking at the various contingencies, things like appearance, competition, and so on. And so far, I really haven't found a domain of life that you can ask people about, do you base your self-esteem on this? That neurotic narcissists won't say, yes, I do that. It doesn't matter what domain it is. Neurotic narcissists are just looking for any sort of external validation. They're looking for people outside to say, yes, I value you on almost any sort of domain. Whereas the other types of narcissism, usually it's more concentrated. So things like competition hold true for essentially every aspect of narcissism, but the neurotic folks seem to be very needy in terms of external affirmation. We found, my lab as well as other labs, I found very similar results in a number of other studies. I'm just going to mention one of these other ones really quickly, just to kind of put this in perspective about other fundamental social motives. So here we're using just the NARC, admiration and rivalry model. We were looking at fundamental social motives here. People argue about what the basic motives are that are true across all humans. Rebecca Neal and her group had a very nice model, I would argue, for looking at basic, absolutely fundamental social motives, so self-protection, disease avoidance, affiliation status, mate seeking, mate retention, and kin care were the ones that they came up with. So this study just looked very quickly at some of the associations that admiration and rivalry had with these different fundamental social motives. In any place where I show figures, I'll be using a very simple baseline, which is I'll show green arrows for positive associations, red arrows for negative associations, and black or gray arrows for no association. So admiration was positively associated with self-protection, disease avoidance, affiliation. So far we've got these folks high in extroverted or narcissistic admiration, love those sorts of motives. When we get to status seeking, now we finally see rivalry starting to kick in. Rivalry wasn't associated with self-protection, disease avoidance, or affiliation, but status seeking, both types of narcissism are starting to spike there. Mate seeking is the other area where both types of narcissism also are in alignment. And this is why when people talk about short-term mating opportunities being a core part of narcissism, I have a hard time disagreeing terribly strongly with that, because I think status-related issues are probably also serving those mate-seeking sorts of opportunities. So I think there's definitely something important here that I don't want to dismiss. Mate retention, we start seeing some issues here where narcissistic rivalry is possibly associated with concerns about mate retention. They're very worried about someone else coming in and taking their mate from them, so they're very concerned about those sorts of issues. And then kin care, we get a divergence where admiration is possibly associated with issues surrounding kin care, whereas rivalry, a very interesting approach where they don't want to take care of other people. They don't want to engage in those sorts of communal sorts of activities that are really good long-term investments. It is not great to not want to take care of people close to you, and so we'll see some issues of that sort coming up as we continue going along. The other thing I want to mention very quickly is, although there were a number of positive associations between admiration, rivalry, and different fundamental social motives, by far the strongest was the admiration connection to status seeking. It is much, much stronger than the others. So as far as how narcissistic individuals actually go about pursuing status, Sarah Hampson years ago had what I thought was just a really nice quote about, she was very interested in the idea of how do personality traits get outside the skin, which I think is something that I think is very helpful for us to think more carefully about. I think oftentimes we're interested in different constructs. We don't really think about how do these things actually manifest in the world around us. And so what I was interested in here was trying to operationalize some of these ideas in terms of how do narcissistic individuals actually bring their status-related concerns into the real world. And I think dominance and prestige-related issues are a large part of that. So as far as dominance-based strategies go, I mentioned earlier, they're really based on conflict. It's use of intimidation, coercion, aggression, induction of fear, taking status from other people, forcing them to give it to you. Well, maybe not forcing them to give it to you because you're just taking it from them. Prestige-based strategies are based on competence, as I mentioned, possessing valuable skills, characteristics, abilities, experience, and knowledge. Here the idea is I'm going to demonstrate my value in such a way that other people are going to voluntarily confer status upon me, right? So two very different approaches to get to the same thing, right? Ascending the status hierarchy. And again, we can talk about this more later, but there are going to be different ramifications for the stability of outcomes related to status that are gained either through dominance or prestige. I won't talk much about this in the studies, but we can sort of chat about it later. If you're going to take status from other people, so if you're going to force them to give you status through a dominance-based approach, that's great, as long as you keep the boot on the throat of the person that you're forcing to give you status, right? At some point, if you weaken, right, there tends to be a lot of instability in those sorts of status-related issues if you're forcing it through dominance. Prestige tends to be more stable. If people are voluntarily conferring status on you, that tends to be a more stable sort of dynamic. And so they're going back to the idea of there are some downsides to having high status, especially if it's gained through dominance, as we'll chat about later. So as far as the pursuit of status and how do narcissistic individuals actually pursue it through dominance or prestige, this first study I'm just going to mention briefly used the admiration and rivalry questionnaire, fundamental social motives that we spoke about a moment ago, the status seeking subscale of that inventory, and then looking at dominance and prestige strategies. So here, dominance-based strategy, an example item, I'm willing to use aggressive tactics to get my way. Prestige-based strategies, things like I'm considered an expert on some matters by others. As far as the results go, here we just have some simple regression models with moderated regressions with admiration and rivalry interacting potentially with status seeking to predict either dominance-based strategy or prestige-based strategies. So admiration possibly associated with dominance, rivalry possibly associated with dominance. The effect here is a bit stronger for rivalry than it is for admiration. Status-seeking motive also is possibly associated with dominance. So basically, if individuals are interested in gaining status, there's certainly variability in the extent to which people are motivated by that. But the more strongly you're motivated by the desire for status, the more willing you are to use dominance-based strategies to gain status. There is also an interaction between admiration and the status-seeking motive. So individuals with high levels of narcissistic admiration were more inclined to use dominance-based strategies, but this was particularly true if their status-seeking motive was also quite strong. As far as prestige-based strategies go, and again, this is focusing on competence-related sorts of issues, admiration was also positively associated with prestige. Notice that the effect here is a bit stronger, considerably stronger than what we got for dominance. Rivalry goes in the opposite direction. So what happens with rivalry, and this will be a pattern that we'll see over and over again. Well, I guess today I'll only talk about a couple of these studies, but we see the very similar pattern over and over again where people high in rivalry or antagonistic narcissism, they are very uncertain about relying on other people for status-related issues. They are very interested in taking status from others. They don't trust that other people will confer status on them, so they don't give them the opportunity because they believe that other people don't value them enough, don't respect them enough. And so they're very reluctant to rely on prestige. Now, whether that's because they don't think they can actually get that, because they lack the qualities, or they believe others don't treat them correctly, is an unknown issue at the moment, I would argue. Status-seeking motive possibly associated with prestige-based strategies as well, but there were no interactions. So for this, what I really want to point out is that notice that for admiration, again, positive associations with both dominance and prestige, so they're flexible. I would argue that the prestige-based approach is a bit stronger for these individuals, but for rivalry, it's very dominance-focused. Not only are they focused on dominance, but they also show an aversion to using prestige-based sorts of strategies. So one of the follow-ups we did to this series of studies, looking at U.S. community members, Israeli community members, some college students mixed in here as well. I'm just going to present a quick summary because I think the basic issues will be very similar to what we just chatted about. So the basic results were very similar, but what we added in here, which is an element which I think is very important, is this idea of the sorts of worldviews that people think that they are living in. There are different approaches to thinking about worldviews, but basically has to do with what is a person's perception of the social environment that they inhabit. And I think that's really important for understanding people's behaviors, because our perceptions can be radically different of exactly the same sort of situation. So my preferred method for thinking about this in the context of those social sorts of encounters is a competitive and dangerous worldview kind of perspective. What I think is going to be really, what I think the data shows over time, is that the tendency for narcissistic individuals to view the world as a highly competitive place really helps us understand the way they approach the world around them. Right, so again, I think for thinking about narcissistic individuals, trying to put yourself into their frame of reference and understand the world through their eyes, I think can be very helpful. And I believe that they view everything as a competition, even if it doesn't need to be, right? They impose competition on a lot of different social encounters. And so our argument here is that we thought that this tendency to adopt a competitive social worldview would mediate the connections that narcissism had with the sorts of approaches individuals took to gaining status from their social environment. So for extroverted narcissism and antagonistic narcissism, we saw very similar sorts of patterns in these studies, where they had positive direct associations with the motive to use dominance-based strategies to gain status, as well as positive indirect associations through the competitive worldview. The size of the effects weren't terribly different, they were quite similar. So basically what tended to show up here is that narcissistic individuals, we're talking about high levels of extroverted, high levels of antagonistic, they tend to see the world as a highly competitive place. It's a dog-eat-dog sort of world, and that's the way they see things. And so as a result, if you see yourself as living in this highly competitive environment, the idea of using dominance to gain status is not crazy. That makes a great deal of sense if that's the way you see the world, and that's the way these people see the world. For prestige, a different pattern showed up, but again, it was very similar for extroverted and antagonistic. They both had positive direct associations with motivation to use prestige-based strategies, as well as a negative indirect association through the competitive social worldview. So for both extroverted and antagonistic, again, they're seeing the world as a very competitive place. If you see the world as a very competitive place, though, it becomes very difficult to rely on others to voluntarily confer status upon you. And so I believe that is what's driving this aversion to prestige, is this tendency to view the world as competitive. If you view the world as competitive, you may be suspicious about whether others are actually going to recognize your expertise and your value to the group, because you think other people are also seeing the world as a dog-eat-dog sort of world, and they aren't going to give you the respect and admiration that you think you deserve. As far as neurotic narcissism, it had a positive direct association with the desire with the motive to use prestige-based strategies, but no indirect association through the competitive social worldview. People high in neurotic narcissism don't have the same sort of orientation to view the world through the same sort of competitive lens that we see with extroverted and antagonistic. Their worldviews are a little bit different in that way. No association with dominance-based strategies. I also mentioned the dangerous worldview. It just doesn't have a great deal to do with narcissism. The dangerous worldview is remarkably important for a number of ideological attitudes. It just doesn't have a great, narcissistic individuals aren't particularly predisposed to view the world as a dangerous place. They don't differ terribly much from non-narcissists in that respect. I want to turn our attention to romantic relationships of narcissistic individuals. So kind of segue into this is to use the same sort of dominance-based and prestige-based strategies in the context of romantic relationships. And I'm going to start this kind of little tour through romantic relationships by talking about mate retention behaviors. So mate retention behaviors are different strategies that individuals use to reduce the likelihood that your partner is either going to cheat on you or to defect from the relationship and end things. So basically the idea of mate retention is once you have a mate, so once you've sought them out, you found them and secured the relationship, it's keeping your mating partner involved in the relationship. So in this first study, we have the idea of admiration and rivalry, dominance and prestige-based strategies for gaining status, and then the use of different mate retention strategies within the relationship. Now, an important note about this is the dominance and prestige approaches we were talking about here are not confined to the romantic relationship. So these are broad strategies that people use to navigate social environments, even outside of the romantic relationship. Benefit provisioning is going to be a particular type of mate retention strategy. So the idea of benefit provisioning is that you're going to make your partner, you're going to try to keep your partner invested in the relationship by demonstrating to them how great it is to be your partner, right? So different positive, this is, in terms of strategies for keeping a partner, this is a great way to go about doing it. Doing things like complimenting your partner, letting them know that you love them, buying them little gifts, right? Those sorts of things to show your appreciation of your partner and how good it is to be involved in a relationship with you. Does that make sense? Hopefully. So what we see here is that narcissistic admiration positively associated with dominance, no connection with benefit provisioning. Cost inflicting is the other broad type of mate retention behavior. This is going to be the unpleasant way of keeping your partner involved in the relationship. This is basically using strategies to kind of wear them down to the point where they think they aren't worthy of finding another partner, or threatening them with either physical violence or the threat of physical violence if they were to leave. So this is a very unpleasant approach to keeping your partner involved in the relationship. Narcissistic admiration doesn't have a direct association with cost-inflicting sorts of strategies, but it does have an indirect association through dominance-based strategies for gaining status. For prestige, we see a positive association with narcissistic admiration and prestige, but prestige doesn't have anything to do with benefit provisioning, but there is a negative association between prestige and cost inflicting. So what we're seeing here is that narcissistic admiration has opposing indirect associations with cost inflicting strategies. So through the dominance pathway, narcissistic admiration is going to be positively associated with the use of cost inflicting strategies, but it's going to have a negative indirect association through prestige. When we think about narcissistic admiration in terms of romantic context, it's almost always kind of a mixed blessing. It isn't uniformly bad. There's some pros and some cons. Early on in relationships, narcissistic admiration and extroverted narcissism have some nice benefits. These folks are charismatic, they're very attractive, they're charming. In the early days of relationships, those are lovely characteristics. Some long-term costs that we can certainly talk about. In terms of mate retention sorts of strategies, again, kind of a mixed blessing where they are going to refrain from cost inflicting through the prestige-based mechanism, but at the same time, they're going to engage in it through dominance. So there are different competing pathways for admiration. It's going to be a complex connection with cost inflicting. Rivalry is going to be nice and simple. By the way, all the romantic stuff I'm going to talk about in the next few minutes, rivalry has a very simple association. Rivalry is bad for romantic relationships. In almost any way you can measure any outcome, antagonistic narcissism and rivalry just are not great for romantic relationships. So rivalry associated with dominance. It's also going to have an indirect association with cost inflicting here. And so with rivalry, it also goes through prestige. It's going to have a negative association with prestige. Prestige has a negative association with cost inflicting. So with rivalry, what we have is a very simple sort of story. People high in narcissistic rivalry are very focused on cost inflicting strategies to keep their partners involved. And this is going to operate both through a dominance-based strategy as well as an aversion to prestige. So if we think about prestige in romantic relationships, right, the idea here is I'm going to do something to demonstrate my value and worth to society or to my social environment to get to confer status. Very similar to kind of this benefit provisioning sort of approach in some ways. And people high in narcissistic rivalry are not keen on that, right? They are keen on using dominance-based sorts of approaches to keep people involved in interactions with them. Because again, they don't trust that their partner or social environment are going to confer these things voluntarily. Again, kind of take-home message, what we've got is that extroverted narcissism has a very flexible sort of strategy in terms of its connections with the pursuit of status, both dominance-based and prestige-based. I believe what's going on is that they prefer prestige and will resort to dominance if forced to do so. I don't have great evidence of that, but I believe that's really what's going on based on effect sizes and some other things. Antagonistic narcissism has a very focused sort of strategy, and it's all about dominance, and it's an aversion to prestige-based sorts of approaches. I want to shift our attention just for a moment to power in romantic relationships. So narcissistic individuals show a very strong desire for power in their relationships. They endorse value systems in various contexts involving power. And they tend to perceive themselves as having power in relationships, depending on the type of narcissism that we're talking about. People high in extroverted narcissism tend to believe they have power. People high in antagonistic narcissism, they don't believe they have power, but they desperately want it. One of the reasons why I think power is so important to narcissistic individuals is because of its ability to help facilitate the ascendance of this social hierarchy. In terms of romantic relationships, what we've done in a number of studies is look at the connections that narcissism has with a wide array of romantic outcomes, and we've looked at the desire for power as a potential mediator of these sorts of associations. And so I'm just going to tell you very quickly about some of those results. Again, the desire for power is exactly what it sounds like. It's, I want to have more power control over my relationship than I currently have. So in this first study, I'll just mention very quickly a couple of samples here. The first one's going to be a monadic sample with 623 community members. The other one is a dyadic sample with heterosexual couples. What we see, and I'm just going to collapse these just in the interest of time, most consistent pattern that we saw across these studies is that antagonistic narcissism had a positive association with the desire for power, which then in turn had negative associations with positive relationship functioning indicators. Things like satisfaction, investment, quality alternatives, commitment, all those things were really impacted quite negatively by the desire for power. We had similar results in both study 1, which dealt with individuals, as well as study 2, which dealt with romantic couples. What we think is going on here is that the desire for power may create a really competitive dynamic in these relationships that erodes cooperation between partners and contributes to conflict. It undermines issues of trust, I believe. There were very similar patterns for men and for women, but one of the things that I will point out is that the level of antagonistic narcissism in women had a much more consistent and much larger impact on the relationship functioning of their male partners compared to the level of antagonistic narcissism in men. So basically what we see is that when women have high levels of antagonistic narcissism, their male partners were much less happy in their romantic relationship. Their male partners also had a stronger desire for power in the relationship. We don't know exactly what's going on. Speculation, though, is that I think a lot of this has to do with gender norms for what's acceptable in romantic relationships. I think women, at least in the studies we were looking at here in these samples, were much more tolerant, I think, of having men with antagonistic narcissism sorts of characteristics. I think women are just kind of like, they kind of sigh and just kind of be like, that's the way men are, right? They're deeply unpleasant, and they were okay with, maybe not okay, but they were more tolerant to that. I think for men, they were more reactive. I think there was a violation of expected gender norms in romantic relationships that really caused a lot of conflict when women were exhibiting the same characteristics. Extroverted narcissism and communal narcissism were positively associated with desire for power, but the indirect associations of romantic outcomes were much more sporadic. There wasn't this nice, clear story that emerged in analysis after analysis, sample after sample. Things were much spottier for them. Neurotic narcissism was positively associated with the desire for power and negatively associated with indicators of relationship functioning, but only for men. And so what we've found here is that the sort of insecurity and the stress that goes along with neurotic narcissism seem to really cause a lot of romantic issues. It might kind of create kind of a power struggle between men and women in their relationships, more so than the other types of narcissism. We found conceptually similar results in some other studies. Looking at things like mate retention behavior, romantic burnout, with the most consistent pattern again being antagonistic narcissism really kind of fostering this desire for power in their relationship, which then has a lot of negative cascading consequences for the relationship itself. Another very quick issue I'll just note is that issues surrounding power also impact the way narcissistic individuals think about sexual relationships as well. When when putting this talk together, I paused on, well, do I really want to just introduce sex in this talk? Because I wasn't sure about the nature of what our talks would be. But based off of the penis study yesterday, I thought this is safe for me to talk about, right? This is very tame compared to that. So basically, if you, what we did in the study is we gave people a number of different aggressive sexual acts that they could potentially perform, and we then asked them about each of these acts. How powerful would you feel if you engaged in this act with a partner, and then how sexually arousing do you feel when you kind of think about this activity? And what we found is that for both admiration as well as rivalry, they were more sexually stimulated by aggressive sexual acts if they thought that they would feel powerful while performing them. So I think those power-related issues inform not only romantic dynamics, but also sexual dynamics as well. There's some really interesting connections between narcissism and emotion, which I'll try to speed through this to give us plenty of time to chat and answer some questions. Issues of anger and rage are absolutely essential. One of my former students and I made the claim at one point that we thought that anger was really kind of the emotional core of narcissism, and I still think there's a lot to that. I think you can make arguments for other emotions as well, but anger, wow, it's an intimate part of narcissism, and I'd be happy to chat more about why I think that's the case later. Issues of pride, shame, envy, I think all of those are fascinating emotions. I'm going to quickly mention a study from Mitya's lab. They collected some absolutely wonderful data. It was deeply impressive, and I was just along for the ride on this. So they collected two large experience sampling studies, 285 college students in one with over 18,000 observations total. The other one had 1,100 community members, 36,000 observations. So they did a wonderful job of collecting this very, very intense data. What we were interested in was looking at narcissism, perceptions of status on a daily level, and then also looking at some of the behavioral manifestations as well as the emotional consequences of those sorts of status-related sorts of perceptions. So we were interested in and found evidence for three different pathways corresponding to the three types of narcissism that we were looking at. So an agentic pathway going along with the extroverted form of narcissism, where they tend to perceive, a lot of times in their social encounters, a lot of social status. They believe other people are granting them social status. So they have a very positive way of viewing ambiguous social situations to be about granting status. They also would then engage in a lot of excessive self-promotion because they thought that things were going quite well for them. They thought people were granting them status, so they would just keep bragging about themselves. They also experienced a lot of positive emotions that were really about, we believe, about signaling status gain, so things like pride and joy. There's also an antagonistic pathway that we identified where people high in rivalry or antagonistic narcissism believe that they are constantly being threatened and attacked in terms of their status. So a lot of other derogation sorts of behaviors were manifesting, and the emotions were deeply tied to this in terms of things like envy and anger, these high arousal emotions that we thought were really kind of signifying the fact that they felt threatened in their daily activities in terms of their level of status. There's also this neurotic pathway where there was more kind of a neglect of status, where people high in neurotic narcissism kind of feel like they're kind of on the bottom of the status hierarchy. They feel like they feel like they should be up higher, but they can't get there. And so they've kind of started to maybe disengage in some ways from the struggle for status. So a lot of social avoidance is what we would see in terms of the actual behavioral manifestations for self-report. In terms of the emotions, they were reporting a lot of shame and insecurity related things, these low arousal sorts of emotions that are signaling status loss or at least kind of neglect from others. My wife and I, she's also a psychologist, she's a comparative psychologist, but she and I had a study terribly long ago where we were looking at similar sorts of issues, but looking at self-esteem as the outcome rather than emotion or behavior per se. What we were really interested in was, following on some of Constantine's work, kind of this hierometer sort of pathway, where we were expecting self-esteem to be tracking status-related issues. So we found the same sort of agentic pathway. People high in narcissistic admiration perceive a lot of status being conferred upon them in their daily life, and as a result, their self-esteem tends to go up. People high in rivalry tend to believe that others are not granting them the status that they so richly deserve, and their self-esteem is not particularly high. We also looked at more the sociometer sort of approach, looking at daily feelings of inclusion. And we were interested in looking at this, but what we were expecting to see is that we would see very strong evidence for kind of a hierarchical pathway, but not a lot going on for inclusion, because oftentimes when we step back and we talk about narcissism, we frequently say they care about status-related stuff, but not about affiliation. Here, the pattern shows they also care about affiliation. They care about other people, including them. People high in admiration, same sort of positive and direct association with self-esteem for inclusion. Rivalry, people high in narcissistic rivalry also feel that people don't include them. They don't feel like people affiliate with them. They don't feel liked by other people. So they don't feel respected by others. They also don't feel liked, right? So people high in rivalry are just very unhappy with their social relationships with others. I also want to give a quick mention, a gentleman named Porter and some of his colleagues. I have nothing to do with this work. I just think it's really interesting. They were interested in taking a circumflex approach and using that for emotions. Let me back up a second. There have been other circumflex sorts of models applied to emotions. This is a different approach. This is using the agency and communion sort of approach to the circumflex and looking at emotions in that context. They looked at narcissism in the context of these sorts of agentic and communal emotions and found that extroverted narcissism was positively associated with agentic emotions, antagonistic narcissism positively associated with agentic emotions like confidence, negatively associated with communal emotions like trust, and neurotic narcissism basically flipped around from antagonistic, where negatively associated with those sorts of agentic emotions, positively associated with communal. So to summarize, what I believe is going on is that narcissism is linked with a desire to get ahead of others, and I think we see that in status, we see it in power, we see it in things like respect. Extroverted narcissism seems to be linked with greater flexibility in the strategies that people use to pursue status. Antagonistic narcissism seems to be very focused on dominance-based sorts of strategies, coupled with an aversion that I did not anticipate in the beginning, that they really want to shy away from prestige. I thought they would be kind of neutral on prestige, but they're not neutral. They do not like prestige-based sorts of approaches. I also, even though I've kind of given a kind of short shrift here, I believe that the tendency to view the world as a competitive place is a really important aspect of narcissism. And I think if you're going to try to kind of put yourself in the mind of a narcissistic individual, I think you could do a lot worse than thinking about it through this lens of competition. Some of these particular behaviors and emotions appear to accompany each kind of narcissistic pathway for pursuing status. The extroverted pathway is quite different from the antagonistic one, which is different in terms from neurotic. There's a really great paper from some of Mitya's folks on looking at kind of this status-based approach, and it's just a really, really nice bit of scholarship. So if you're interested in these sorts of ideas, this is a wonderful paper to pick up. It's great. As far as future directions, sorry, in the interest of time, I'll just fly through this. I think a couple of things that would be very interesting for the future, going back to agency and communion. I think starting to differentiate different aspects of the agentic and communal axes could be really interesting. Looking at two facets of agency, the idea of assertiveness, being determined and confident, versus ability, competence and capability, which has some similarities to the dominance and prestige pathways, not exactly the same, but some similarities there. I'm also really interested in diving more deeply into the different facets of communion, morality, and friendliness. I've been interested for a long time in trying to integrate morality more into the narcissism work, and I was really excited to hear so many interesting talks yesterday interested in the same sorts of issues. And I think this is a really nice distinction for communion that I think is very helpful, at least for me. So in conclusion, what I think is going on is that narcissism may reflect a psychological system for navigating social hierarchies. I think the narcissistic desire for status may be so intense and pervasive, again, that it shapes much of the social lives of narcissistic individuals. And with that, I thank you, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you for your wonderful talk. And we have time for questions. Yes?
Right. I know that I think the questions will come to more specific stuff, but I just want to open up a bit of a reflection.
Sure.
And I'll do so from an outside perspective because I don't really, and agnostic because I don't really work in this area. But because you raise a few points of how constructs can be related. So the things that are in my mind. So assuming that parsimony is a goal of science, and also because there's just a published paper in Nature Human Behavior on defragmenting psychology. Yeah, because it's really fragmented. So, and I understand as well in the structural perspective of personality, people talking about the meta dimensions, the 5 or 6, nuances and the specific traits. But going back to the goal of science, or parsimony being a goal, is it a risk to keep going in this direction of fragmenting further and further? Because it's like what came to my mind is a Venn diagram of you get extroversion and narcissism, and you get what the variance they have, that they share variance, and then you create a new construct, a new measure. But when does it stop? And then another thing that came to my mind is a paper by a Canadian colleague, Gordon Hodgson, I believe, on jingle-jangle fallacy, and how in cross-sectional studies, we know that it's better to use structure equation modeling because you control for correlation between the constructs and the error. So some of your findings, for example, the correlation of 0.6, and I believe there's a zero order correlation. If you run a latent construct, this correlation would be really high. So can you justify to have separate constructs then if the correlation be over 0.8, let's say? So it's just reflections, because I think it's related to your talk, but also what I heard yesterday, we are fragmenting more and more instead of going back.
Yes, so that's a wonderful question. So I'll kind of have a rambling response to that, and hopefully there'll be some element of answering the question. So I'm deeply concerned about jingle jangle sorts of issues. I think that I'm glad that people are bringing those issues back up because I think they're deeply important to the field. I remember when I was a student hearing older colleagues and mentors lament about how people were just kind of rediscovering things that we already knew 20 or 30 years ago. And at the time I was so excited thinking, well, these are new ideas, they're a little bit different. And now kind of being on the other side of that, I see that we're putting an old wine in new bottles. And I think there are issues of that sort that I think are deeply problematic. I think as a field, we have some issues where construct labels, I think there are certainly issues of people using very different terms to mean the same underlying thing, and I think sometimes we are really, I think we're parsing things in ways that aren't necessary. So I agree with that. I also think as a field we have issues where we sometimes use the same construct, same term, and we mean very different sorts of things. So I think as a field it would be much better for us to be very precise about what do we mean when we say whatever this construct is. So I'm completely on your side there. I think as far as the level of specificity goes, I think it's difficult to find them. I think it really depends on what is the question that you're trying to answer. What's the research question that you're trying to answer? I'm skeptical about some of the, if we think about what is the appropriate number of personality traits, I think there are different arguments that could be made. Big Five versus Hexaco kind of perspectives. I'm kind of agnostic. I think both approaches have some validity. I get a little bit nervous when people start moving too far up in terms of there's an approach arguing for a big one personality trait, and I don't know what that is. I've read papers. I I've struggled with it. I still don't get it. I'm not saying it's not right. I'm just saying I don't understand it. At the same time, I completely agree with you about how far down do we kind of dig into these things. And for me, I think it's a matter of kind of balancing the structure and process. Like, are we getting to a level where the differences in the constructs are manifesting in some way that really it's important? We're seeing differences between the constructs in a way that matters in some way, that we're not just kind of parsing things so finely that the differences are really kind of trivial. I was talking to a colleague recently, and we were talking about different types of religious affiliations, and oftentimes you have people who are members of different religions, but they're so close that the differences are, from an outsider's perspective, don't make any sense. It's just like you have the same religion, but they see themselves quite differently. I think the same thing happens in personality. I think sometimes there are a lot of different motives for that. People want constructs that they have developed. They want to kind of have an ownership kind of stake in these things. And I think there are problems with that. So I think finding the right level of specificity is a challenge. I'll tell you a quick bit about that. When part of the reason I mentioned some of the folks who have done work thinking about the structure of narcissism is about 15 years or so ago, I was ready to just kind of give up on narcissism research because I thought we were kind of at a dead end. Where we were just kind of stuck. The measurement of narcissism I thought didn't make a great deal of sense. There were some weird quirks in the way the measurement kind of took over in the field that was different than what you see in a lot of other areas. And I thought as a field we were just kind of stuck. People were very rigid. I've had some conversations with some people who I respect in most other areas, but they would say things like, narcissism is whatever the NPI tells you it is. And I'm like, what? This doesn't make any sense. Like, this is not the way constructed measurement issues are supposed to be kind of fitting together. And I was ready to kind of give up because I thought as a field we're in this rut. We're going, I think, in a direction that isn't great. We're not going to get out of this. And then I was deeply relieved to see people actually kind of knock us out of that rut, start thinking about narcissism more deeply. And so at the moment, I don't think this is necessarily the right approach to thinking about narcissism, but I think where we are right now is I think we're in a much better place than we were 15, 20 years ago, where we were just kind of stuck in a kind of weird way of thinking about narcissism. So I don't know if that answered
Yeah, it's just a reflection.
Yeah.
I think it's
I think it's a great question.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
Of course, I will ask and comment on communal narcissism, of course. Thank you for your talk because it really helped me in thinking more deeply about what I'm studying. And my first reflection is that maybe communal narcissists are not so much obsessed by power, but by being liked.
Mm-hmm.
And if there are, so maybe it's more about sociomaterial, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
And if they are so much obsessed, they cannot use antagonistic way of restoring the likability, because it is a paradox.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that this is this point when whole this beautiful story does not fit the real life, yes? And what is our team are trying to do, yes, is to show that maybe we are so obsessed in antagonistic aspects of narcissism that we overlook another possibility, like unwanted helping, yes? Because people manipulate others also using soft power.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe this using this aggressive communion in the full with full consequences, what we also try to do, proposing circumplex model of narcissism, probably makes sense, yes, and it is very good, I think, supplementation to Tashiano mentioned, yes, where we should stop in our reductionism and where we should stop to be too specific, yes, and I think that thanks to your talk, I think that we have a very nice suggestion what we should focus and what we should ignore. So thank you so much.
I'm really interested in how communal narcissism kind of fits in with all of this. Yeah, and I do think it's really interesting in terms of are they really driven by communal sorts of issues? And I'm not convinced that they are. I definitely think it's important, but I think at the end of the day, I think what they're really doing is using these communal sorts of strategies to kind of get what they want. I think your issue of like soft power sorts of things, I think is spot on. I think they're doing these sorts of helping sorts of strategies, not out of anything remotely resembling honest kind of genuine, I really want to help you, but it's to get something for themselves out of it, I believe. But yeah, I think it's very interesting.
Thank you, Virgil, for a fine talk. You pointed out that narcissists assume a competitive social worldview. I was wondering whether you think that manipulating a cooperative social worldview would work, would reduce some of their needs for status, power, etc.
I think it definitely would. Now, how well that would work, I think it definitely would. So that my short answer is yes. I think that would definitely reduce some of these sorts of issues. Now, what would that mean outside of the lab setting? I think that's one of the things I would be very interested in is, could we actually do this in a way that would reduce some of the, like for people high in antagonistic narcissism, for example, could we do that in a way that would actually last beyond like the 10 or 15 minutes for the typical kind of social personality lab study? And that's the part that I'm a little less certain about. I think these worldviews are deeply ingrained in us, and I think we can move them around temporarily in the lab, which I think is step one. Can we actually do this? And then I think the other part is there a way for us to do this that would actually really change their lives for more than just a few minutes for the lab study? And so I'd be very interested in that. But the short answer is, yeah, I think that'd be one of the ways we could do this, is by convincing them that the world really isn't the same sort of dog-eat-dog, zero-sum game world that you always think it is. So I think that'd be very interesting. Please.
So I agree with you, but let's imagine that a narcissist is related, he has a long-term relationship with a very friendly, cooperative person. Can their partner tame them in the long run?
I think it's possible. I think it's unlikely to happen. What I think is probably more likely to happen is for the narcissistic partner to consistently exploit the other person. That would be my guess. That's my very pessimistic view of the world. Now, I like if what you're suggesting is that maybe the more cooperative partner could eventually kind of reset some of these worldviews. I like that approach. I would prefer to live in that world, and I think for some people that's exactly what happens. But I think it's very difficult. I think like we see in the attachment literature, once these things get set, I think it's very difficult to change. I'm not quite pessimistic to say that it can't change, but I think it's very difficult. I think a lot of times what probably happens is that narcissistic individuals realize they can exploit the other person, and that's kind of the pattern that emerges in the relationship. I think that there is a possibility that the healthier partner could help the narcissistic person realize that the world doesn't have to be as competitive, at least our relationship doesn't have to have this competitive sort of dynamic. So I do have some optimism that can happen. Now, how often it happens, I think would be a different sort of issue.
Maybe it's necessary that the partner actually is a therapist.
That would help.
Relationship with a therapist.
Patience and tolerance of a saint, right? I think that would be one of the keys.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you very much. I'd like just one more question. I'm not a specialist in narcissism, but actually I'm very interested in projective identification, which is one of the mechanisms, as far as I know, narcissists uses. There's this mechanism, it's a very primitive one. But I believe this mechanism lets narcissism to cope with two things, his power exerting power and desire for aggression, and on the other hand, being close to another, right?
No.
Because look, when we use projective identification, we don't, I hope, but if someone uses projective identification, the person can at the same time stay close in the relationship, control it, but being aggressive at the same time. So maybe searching for, looking at the issue from the mechanism, from this projective identification point of view, can help us to see this complex of this issue, because narcissism is not just one axis, right? It's more complex than that. It's not just only exerting power, only being close. I believe they try to do something complex in this, like mixing those two things. I'm not sure if I'm right, but I think why is this question? Because I've seen such mechanism as a psychotherapist, and that they use it. And when I started to think about it, I thought, okay, they want to do two things at the same time. They want being close, and being aggressive at the same time, because being aggressive helps them to being close. So it's this is my observation, actually.
No, I think it's a great point. And you know, when you think about the agency communions of its vaccines, most of us are going through life and trying to balance these things in different relationships. You know, at different times, one thing may take more or less priority than the other. But I think you could be right that you can also see situations where individuals will use one approach to kind of gain the other. And I think that might be what's going on with communal narcissism potentially. But I think in romantic relationships, I think you certainly see those sorts of things of, I want the closeness to the partner, but I'm using them to get something else that I want. So whether it's I'm going to dominate them, whether it's I'm going to use them as a trophy to show how valuable I am by having a trophy sort of partner, I think there are different sorts of strategies that individuals can use. But I like the idea of kind of using one thing to get something else. And I think those complex dynamics are very difficult to capture empirically, but I think there's something very important about it.
Thank you. And I think we can continue the discussion during the coffee break.
Thank you.